Well, we're back, and as you can tell from the fact that I'm again wearing a different t-shirt, it's day 3 of this build. By the way, this is not a Race Day Quads t-shirt. Pay attention carefully. A little Easter egg for you. The reason that it's now day 3 is because last night I made a pizza with my son and didn't work on this video. Sue me. And the other reason it's day 3 is because this flight controller is pretty freaking different from any flight controller that I've worked with before, and I wanted to spend the time to actually download and read the freaking manual to be sure I was getting it right. And to be honest with you, I really need to do just a separate review of this flight controller all by itself, because to go into all of its cool features would just take way too much time for this build video. But I do want to point out one of the super cool things about it is that it has 2 gyro chips. Now you're probably thinking, lots of flight controllers have 2 gyro chips, and you're right. But all those other flight controllers, you use one gyro or the other. This flight controller has a thing called sensor fusion, where you have the 2 of the exact same gyro. You see this one's 45 degrees rotated from this one? And that basically means that you can do some special math that basically does filtering, like the PT1 and the biquad and the notch filter. It lets the flight controller do some filtering, but the filtering basically doesn't have any additional delay, which is the main downside of filtering. So basically this flight controller comes with free filtering. In theory, you could use higher D gains, get cooler motors, smoother running motors, and better prop wash handling because you can turn some of the software filters off. That's the promise anyway. The other cool thing I gotta point out is this SD card slot. And I know what you're thinking. Lots of flight controllers have SD card slots, but this one does. They all just use it for black box logging. This one, you can store your firmware file, like a hex file, on the SD card, and then at boot up time, the flight controller reads the firmware file off the SD card. So if I'm understanding this feature right, what it basically means is that you could have an iNav SD card, a Butterflight SD card, a Betaflight SD card, and by swapping SD cards, you just basically are changing the firmware that's running on the flight controller. That's pretty cool. So I gotta dig deeper into this flight controller, but for now, let's just install it and get it wired up. One thing that is kind of confusing about this is, so like Dominic Clifton, the guy who designed this, he loves plugs. His SPRacing F3 flight controller was one of the first ones to come with these little plugs for the UARTs. So you could plug in your peripherals instead of having to direct solder them, which well, anyway, I mean, older flight controllers had plugs. Then we started direct soldering, and then he went back to using plugs. But like the one plug you would expect to be on here isn't here, the ESC plug. Every flight controller out today has a plug to go to a 4-in-1 ESC, and this one doesn't seem to have that. So we're going to be direct soldering. Joshua from the future here. I checked with Dominic Clifton on this, and he said that this particular ESC is designed primarily for use with individual ESCs, not for a 4-in-1. He said if you are using a 4-in-1 ESC, he makes another flight controller in the SPRacing H7 line that doesn't have the ESC power pads. It doesn't have a built-in PDB, and it does have a 4-in-1 plug. The takeaway is that because this flight controller has the built-in PDB with the ESC power pads on it, there's just not enough freaking room on the PCB to fit a 4-in-1 plug. So that's the answer. What I like to do is set the flight controller on top. I've used female-to-female standoffs here. Because the flight controller has these gummies, these soft mount gummies, it can be a little hard to, if you have the male-to-female standoffs, get the nuts on. But what I like to do is, here's my screwdriver. It's missing. There we go. Just use female-to-female and then drive a screw down in. And that gives a more low profile. I have accidentally intermingled the lengths of the screws. I'm going to lower this down by about 2 millimeters. So we're going to need screws that are 2 millimeters shorter than that, because we're going to take one of these nuts out and lower the whole stack by about 2 millimeters. So the problem is this. Everything's looking good except I've realized that there's not enough spacing between the top deck and the flight controller. So I need to lower this stack. I need to somehow. And what I'm going to do is I had to raise the ESC up because the screws were sticking through the bottom a little more. So I went back and I found the correct length of shorter screws, so I can now lower the ESC by 1 nut height worth. But that also means now I have to use shorter screws going into my stack. And this is why you need a freaking assortment. And this is the part where Chad Capper says, why do people have to go through this? Why can't the gear just ship with the parts that it needs? He would say. He did say. He did a video where he did a beginner build. And this was one of the points that he made in the beginner build, was this nonsense for someone who's doing a quadcopter build. You just want to fly a quadcopter. This is a lot of nonsense. Except, here's my response. Oh, yeah, just, you know, I'll go anywhere. My response to that is that I tried to do a kit with Rotor Riot where everything you needed came in the kit. My JB budget build. And the kit was always out of stock. And it was always out of stock because some little piece that was needed was always missing. Apparently, no one can do it. No one can just get all this stuff, have it be in stock in one place at the same time. All the parts that you need, the right height of standoff, and etc. No one can freaking do it. So we got to do this nonsense. And you might be thinking to yourself, well, I would be a smart cookie. I am going to buy a flight controller and ESC stack that comes from the manufacturer pre-built. And I'm going to avoid all this nonsense. And the problem with that is you're going to get it and it's going to be the wrong height for the frame. And you're going to need to go through all this BS anyway, because you're going to need to swap out the spacers and whatnot. So there's really just no freaking way around this. No matter what, how clever you think you are. I mean, you can just get a great big freaking frame, a great big honking frame with lots of room, no low deck design. And then, of course, you just stick whatever you want in it. But that's just not what people are doing these days. All the frames that people are making are super low profile, low deck, and then it means that when you're building them, you gotta freaking go jump through crazy hoops in order to fit everything in there. We need a screw and standoff set that comes in 1mm increments. That's where we could start. That's where we could start. Because look, I've had to pull the whole freak. I just got to do this. So I'm just talking to kill time. Welcome to my life. I gotta pull the whole freaking stack apart because the ESC is soldered up. So now I can't easily take this apart. All because I misjudged the height of the stack by like 0.5 millimeter. God help you if this is like your first build, which probably it isn't, because this is some pretty premium gear. But God help you if this is your first build and you don't have $50 worth of freaking screw assortments. Capper's not wrong. It shouldn't be this complicated. You shouldn't have to have $50 worth of screw assortments and standoffs in order to buy a freaking ESC and flight controller and put them in a freaking quadcopter. Nevertheless, the reason why these things happen are non-trivial to overcome, I guess is the kindest thing I could say, having tried to solve that problem for myself with my budget build. Like literally with the budget build. Literally, if you don't know what I'm talking about, I did a JB budget build. I did it exclusively with Rotor Riot, where they were going to have all of the parts, everything. Like the problem is that you buy a quadcopter kit and it doesn't have the one little fiddly size of screw you needed to finish the build, and then you're especially as a beginner, you're effed. You're really frustrated. So what I wanted is every single thing you could possibly need to finish the build. I'm like, this is going to be so much value. We're going to sell so many of them. Nobody else has done this, and I see why now. This wasn't when Race Day Quads was running the Rotor Riot warehouse, for the record. This was when Lauren was doing it, and just like literally at one point, Capper went to a hardware store in Ohio and got a couple bags of freaking 7mm screws or something, because sourcing it from China was, I don't know, that was what was holding it up. And I should have taken that as a sign of how the project was going to go. I mean, kudos to him for just getting it done, right? Yeah, good. But that's not a sustainable approach, and in fact, it wasn't. Every freaking month, we were waiting for something, some little odd and end to come back into stock. Every freaking month, something was out of stock, and we had to hold it up. And oftentimes, it was a little odder end, like some screws or an XT60 pigtail. The whole thing was just on hold because of that. It's funny, I never thought of that. We did that episode, Chad built, he spec'd and built a beginner quad. And he was saying, you know, no, we shouldn't have to go through this. It's like, well, we had the chance to do it right, and we didn't. So I guess that means, oh yeah, that's way better. See, now look. Oh, yes, that's how it needed to be. Now I've finally got all the lengths of the freaking standoffs right, and I can get on with my life. So then the ESC comes handily with this awesome pigtail ready to go into this plug to connect to your flight controller, so quick and easy, and yet the SPRacing doesn't have a plug for the ESC, so we're going to be direct soldering. I'm going to pass that back underneath. Okay. We're going to pass this back underneath, and we'll set this down on top like so, with the front facing arrow facing front. If we ever need to replace this, don't worry, we'll have to take this off anyway, so not really doing ourselves any harm by sort of tying up the wires there. And the ESC doesn't come with a pinout diagram. That's unfortunate. Does it? No. That's unfortunate. We'll have to look that up online. But I guarantee you that red is VBAT and black is ground. Then we've got, yeah, 4 motor wires, and we've got current sense and telemetry. Joshua from the future here again. Joshua in the past is about to make a big mistake. If you are following along, do not make this mistake. He just looked at those red wires and said to himself, oh, those are both VBAT. Yeah, sure they are. He thought he knew the pinout for this ESC off the top of his head. He was wrong. One of the red wires is VBAT, one is 10 volts. Some ESCs will have 2 VBAT wires, and they'll just, just to carry the current, but that is not the case here. He is about to twist those wires together, and the very first time he goes to fly this quadcopter, the ESC it's actually going to impressively fly for about 15 seconds and then die. It's not the ESC's fault. It's because he was a dummy, and he put the 10-volt regulator and the VBAT wire right together, and it fried the regulator. So only use the VBAT wire. Don't use the 10-volt wire. Look at the pinout here, identify the correct wire, and be aware that what Joshua is doing is a mistake that will cost him $70 when he fries his ESC. Read the pinouts, folks. Read the freaking pinouts. Even if you think you know the pinout by heart, read the pinout. And don't make a video showing people how to fry their ESCs. And they've got 2 wires for VBAT and ground, and that, I guess, is just to provide additional current carrying capacity. No, it isn't. Nope. For the thin wires, usually the amount of current pulled by a flight controller is not enough to really stress these wires out. It's probably just an abundance of caution. So here we've got the input pads for the SPRacing F7, battery minus and battery plus. That's where we're going to power them. If we were using individual ESCs, then we would put the XT60 here, but we're not, so. This is the last time I'm going to reiterate this. If you twist those red wires together like I do here, you will fry your ESC. Don't do that. The white wires coming from the ESC are the 4 motor wires, and I've sort of done myself a disservice because I'm not sure which of these is motor 1, 2, 3, or 4. That's okay. I'm just going to solder them up randomly, and then I'll fix it later. I'll reorder the motors in software later. It would be better, especially if you're not really super confident with reordering the motors in Betaflight, to just make sure you do the correct motor order with 1, 2, 3, 4. That's the usual motor order for Betaflight. This flight controller, I dare say I wouldn't recommend it for beginners. For one thing, it's just super complicated because it has so many functions. It's complicated like a 747 is complicated. It can do a lot, but if you just plunk you down in the cockpit of a 747, you probably wouldn't even know how to get the engines going. There's just so much on here that for a beginner to figure out where the wires go, I think would be challenging. There is a very good manual, don't get me wrong, but the manual is also pretty dense. The other thing is that the soldering on some of this is going to be pretty tight for someone with maybe who isn't the most experienced. A lot of the pads, like if you look here, are pretty close together, and some of you guys are a little ham-fisted with your soldering iron and maybe might need a little more room. I, however, will be just fine. And again, I'm not paying any attention to which one of these is which, motor 1, 2, 3, or 4. I'm just soldering the 4 motor wires up randomly. We will sort it out in software later. Here we come to something that's interesting and unique about the T-Motor F55 ESC. And the first time I encountered this, I was sure the ESC was broken. The T-Motor F55 ESC has both a current sense and a telemetry output. Typically, ESCs will have only one or the other of these, but some ESCs have both, and they just let you decide. And I say let you decide because they're usually a little bit redundant. BLHeli telemetry has current sensing information in it, amps and milliamp hours, and the current sense output measures the same exact data, just reports it in a different way. So typically you would only use one or the other, and then if an ESC includes both of them, it's because they don't know which one your flight controller. Not all flight controllers support both of those very easily. But in this case, T-Motor is not just giving you the option to pick, because the ESC telemetry does not include current sensing in it. And the first time I encountered this, the guy said, "Oh, my current sensor isn't working." And I spent so long troubleshooting whether his telemetry was working, and it was. And I said, "I can't figure it out, dude. If telemetry's working, then the current sense information has to be there." Well, that's not true for this ESC. If you want current sensing, you will be using the blue wire, which is analog current sense, and that's your only option. If your flight controller doesn't have an input for analog current sense, you won't get current sensing from this ESC. That may be a reason why you would stay away from it if your flight controller didn't have that. We're going to wire up both telemetry and analog current sensing. And to be honest with you, current sensing is really the main reason I use ESC telemetry. The other information that's in ESC telemetry is the motor RPMs and the ESC temperature. That's basically it. Motor RPMs are sometimes interesting, I guess. But mostly I want the current data so that I can know my amps and my milliamp hours. And for most people, I think you're probably going to wire up just the current sense, not the telemetry. The other thing is that this flight controller has so many spare UARTs. We may as well wire up the telemetry. There's no reason not to. Current sense is going to go to the ADC pad on this guy. A lot of flight controllers would label that RSSI or current, and ADC is the generic name for what it is. Analog to digital converter. So here's where it gets fiddly, guys. We've got TX4 and RX4 right here. So we're going to wire up ESC telemetry to RX4. And this is going to be fiddly, especially with my big, thick, honkin' chisel tip iron, but let's go for it. I'm going to try to, we need R4. I'm going to try and get the corner of my iron down on this. There we go. Down in there. There we go. Nice. That is, I couldn't tell you how I did that. And if you can't do it, I couldn't tell you how to do it, but I got it done. And now, oh, come on, baby. Oh, so good. It feels so good. Okay. And then, now that that's all soldered up, the last thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to kind of pull this out, and I'm going to try and, like, I should probably just lift this guy off of here. Yeah, that's what I'm going to do. I'm just going to clean this up by twisting the wires up. Now that they're soldered in the right place, let's get this rat's nest kind of cleaned up. And well, actually, if you have a heat gun, you can actually hit it a little bit with a heat gun. Silicone insulation will take a set, and if you hit it with a heat gun just a little bit, see how much neater that is? Just a little umbilical there. Oh yeah, very nice. Very nice. Remember I said the flight controller required a little bit of fiddly soldering? Well, this is what I'm talking about. These little guys here are solder bridges to control the voltage that is output to the video transmitter and the camera. And a lot of beginners are going to lift a pad trying to solder these. Hopefully I will not, but again, this is just going to be really challenging if you don't have a lot of experience. So, for the VTX, we're going to give it VBAT. There we go. And for the camera, I'm going to try giving it 5 volts. Sometimes cameras do better off of VBAT, but a lot of times they do good off 5 volts. So that's what we're going to do. And just by bridging either center to left or center to right, it'll select 5 volts or BAT for both of those.